So the next country that Intel considered on its short list was Chile, or Chile, as we say, of course, here in the United States. And so what's interesting about Chile as a location for Intel is, of course, it is a tiny market, only 17 million people, but as we mentioned before, that didn't matter to Intel. They were planning to export everything outside of the country. The also interesting thing here is that most of Chile's population is concentrated within, a lot of Chile's population is concentrated in Santiago. I say most, but really it's more about half almost, maybe about 7 or 8 million people in a country of 17 million. So what I think is interesting here is that, Intel knew that would be where it would probably find the most, it'd be easiest to find skilled workers. You could go, of course, to the north part of Chile, the Atacama Desert. You're not going to find many skilled workers there. You can go to the Antarctic region very far south in Chile. You're not going to find many skilled workers there. They wanted to be in the state, in the city near the vicinity of Santiago. The problem was, of course, and if we look at this, and you can see why. Well, here's a look at this. I mean, you can see why Santiago was also a very attractive location for expatriate executives. A good place to live if you're an expat. You'd love to be in Santiago, a very beautiful city, very safe, great place for security and so on. So if we think about this, we look at Chile from Intel's perspective. There are many positives. That the education system for the universities was outstanding. The engineers, the very few of them that were produced, was very high quality. But again, Chile, what's interesting to note about Chile is it, at least since the 1970s, has adopted a very market-oriented, free trade, liberal model in terms of its economic policies. In other words, the government doesn't interfere, doesn't impose trade barriers here, tries to keep things very oriented toward the market forces. And so that's very much a policy in Chile. And as a result, what you see is that the industries that do exist in Chile tend to be based on where Chile genuinely has a comparative advantage. That happens to be things like copper and primary products like exports of wood, or salmon, these kinds of things, fruit, wine. Okay, that's a little bit value added, but you get the idea. Chile really isn't oriented because of its free market approach. It hasn't developed, behind protectionist tariff barriers, these manufacturing industries as some other countries have. And, it probably doesn't make sense for it to do that because it's a small economy and it's more oriented toward exporting these primary products. Well, as a result, the education system of Chile, right, there are high-quality universities, top-notch engineers, but not a lot of them because the economy hasn't been completely oriented toward that, developing people for the manufacturing sectors. So you're not going to find lots of these, mid-level technicians in Chile. So what's interesting is, on the one hand, you had the positive of the high-quality education. On the other hand, because there were not lots of highly trained, skilled workers, the amount of them was small, you have higher costs for those kinds of people, okay, just supply and demand. The other issue, there's positive transportation infrastructure. I mean, in Santiago, of course, fantastic and great airport and beautiful subway system and all that sort of thing. But there are some negatives. Even Intel noticed immediately that it takes a long time to get, to Chile from Chandler, Arizona, or Santa Clara, California, Intel's headquarters. And so that there aren't a lot of direct flights. And so that was going to be an issue for the expatriates flying back and forth and so on. And another interesting thing was the capital controls. And Chile, despite its very much this free market, liberal, business-friendly orientation, at that time, now it since has changed, but at that time, Chile had capital controls in place on portfolio capital investments. And this was the one exception to the free market, free trade policies in Chile. They said, okay, if you're going to put an investment in our stock market, we're going to ask that you keep 30% of the amount that you invested in our central bank for 1 year. And you can't remove that investment for a year. Okay, so there were these kinds of controls to kind of stabilize the exchange rate and so on. Chile has since removed those controls, but at that time they were in place. It was the one minor exception, to the free market approach. And I think what was surprising is that, the Intel team focused on that. It really, they weren't going to be making that kind of investment. They weren't going to invest in the stock market. They were going to make a foreign direct investment, a significant investment in a factory. So, this really wasn't going to have an effect on them. And the government officials in Chile that Intel met with, I think, were perplexed that they focused so much on that. And Intel really had this perspective, this government of Chile, they must be very nationalistic, or they must put a lot of controls on economic factors. And I think they really didn't have a true understanding of what Chile's policies were all about. When it came to the tax incentives issue, this was another interesting misunderstanding on their part. Ted wrote to the government of Chile, tell us about your tax breaks. It's Intel, a very significant investment we're thinking about here. What sort of tax incentives would you offer to that sort of company? And the government officials wrote back, of course, we don't offer that. We're a free market economy. We believe in letting the market forces decide. If investment comes, it comes. We don't try to play those games of, offering this tax break or that tax break. We just have one low tax rate and it comes or it doesn't come. The same thing with their trade policy, right? They have one single uniform external tariff rate, very low, for many years, 6%, one rate. And if products enter the market, they enter. Otherwise, they're not going to put up tariff barriers to try to protect certain industries. They don't believe in that. Let the free market forces determine what products enter or don't enter. So the government officials Chile was meeting with, and this, of course, the agency referred to in the case, I'm going to write it here, Corfo, and you'll see it all spelled out there in the case and what it stands for. But that was the Economic Development Agency charged with interacting with and negotiating with these prospective foreign investors. That's the one that any foreign investor would interact with at some point if you're investing in Chile. And Corfo officials were just perplexed, by this. And they said, we can offer incentives if they're willing to go to the Antarctic region. We have some exceptions. We're a very, very poor part of the country. We have a special, development zone. But, if they're going to go to Santiago, we're not going to offer incentives. So Intel was just flabbergasted by this. Ted said, don't you understand? This is Intel. And again, my question was, why didn't he know this? He took my class. Oh, right, it dawned on me. Okay, he missed class, right, so many times. So, I think that may help explain what happened. But the government officials in Chile of Corfo tried. They told me, please, talk to them, even though, and I said it's no use, So I think what is interesting is that Intel ruled Chile out as well. And I think that was, I think that probably they wouldn't have even put Chile on the short list if they had really deeply understood the real aspects of the Chilean business environment that you would get from a course like this. If you attend class, of course, you would understand. But, also I think in some respects, really, Chile wasn't suited for this kind of substantial manufacturing investment, right? Because given its free market approach, it didn't really have that sort of manufacturing industry in the country. And so the Chilean officials were so dismayed. They really were shocked that they lost this investment, that they came to Thunderbird, right? I had been talking to them, we got to know them. They actually came to Thunderbird, and we helped them. We developed a program for them to attract new kinds of investment. And so chapter 3 of my book on harnessing globalization talks about that experience and talks about how Chile, the Chilean government shifted its investment promotion strategy based on this experience and also working with Thunderbird. We actually hired Thunderbird full-time student. Every semester we sent one down for us for a few years to help the government officials, modify their approach and make it more suited to the kinds of investment that would work. And as a result, Chile now has been very successful, not in attracting these kinds of heavy manufacturing industries like they were trying to do with this Intel case, but in attracting things like call centers, software development centers, things related to financial services, right? So it turned out that Chile had a great opportunity to diversify its economy. It just wasn't approaching it the right way. So that's one aspect of this story. But the other aspect, I think, is that Intel moved on, and we'll talk about the next locations in the next segment.